Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
Welcome back to The Law Show this Sunday morning here on CIL 650. I'm Sterling Fox, producer Dwayne Bishop with the tunes in the background. Illegal Alien, a good old Genesis song, keeping the wheels turning this morning. Gordon Maynard and Rudy Kisher are with us, immigration lawyers, both with Maynard, Kisher, Stojkovic, a law firm downtown on Hamilton Street and online at vancouverlaw.ca. And birthright is what we're going to talk about next. We're talking about citizenship this morning in the wake of all of those heartfelt, wonderful, warm ceremonies we witnessed on the tube just a few days ago on Canada Day. So an excellent opportunity to sort of renew our sense of citizenship, and for those of us who take so much of it for granted, to understand how many of the rules have changed, how much the process has changed in recent times, and maybe just to refresh our attitudes and our minds on some of the basic rules. And I was reminded, not so gently either, I hasten to add, during the break, that we neglected to include birthright as an element for discussion on the basics of citizenship. And Gordon sort of chided me for it because
gently,
very, very kindly. And he's a hockey player just recovering from a broken leg. He had to be gentle there. But it was about, I think we all take for granted that if you're born in Canada, you're automatically a Canadian citizen, and that's still the case, is it not?
Absolutely.
Okay, so how have the rules, what other perceptions of birthright? For example, Rudy raised the case a second ago. What about a person from another country who wants to have a child in Canada? So they book a hotel room at VGH from wherever they are, and they come over, rather large, one would assume, and they have a child in Canada. Now, that foreign person has a little Canadian, right? Is that kid still automatically Canadian because he was born in our country?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
Foreign parents.
Foreign parents. If you look at what happened on Wednesday, on Canada Day, the people that were there they had gone through an application process where they were getting a grant of citizenship. So they had filled out the forms, made the application, paid the fee, taken a test, put their time in here. Myself, I was born in Canada. I am under the citizenship automatic. By birth, I am a Canadian citizen.
Right.
A citizen. Now that is not. Every country has different rules for citizenship. So, for example, a foreigner born in Japan most likely will not get Japanese citizenship. That's countries from the older world, unlike countries that were founded on immigration recently, tend to be much more likely to sort of be based on citizenship is based on being from a lineage, a blood lineage connected to the country.
This is something I don't mean to interrupt, but this is something Canadians, I don't think, would understand. We assume that because we do things a certain way, and we're pretty fair, well, everybody else must be doing it exactly the same, and that's just not the case.
Yeah, and it's a very, stark, for an example, we have you assume that because your parents are Canadian citizens, that that you would be a Canadian citizen. But under our laws, it also depends. They've changed recently. What we call the second generation born abroad will no longer be a Canadian citizen. So you can imagine a case where somebody's working abroad, they have a child, that child born abroad will be a Canadian citizen. Let's assume both the parents are Canadian citizens.
Yeah.
Until recently, until the recent changes, if that child remained abroad, didn't come back to Canada, had a child, and that child would be, the assumption would be that child was now a Canadian citizen.
With parents and grandparents.
Be Canadian.
But not the case.
Not the case anymore. The rules have changed dramatically. And that's so that second generation born abroad is no longer automatically a Canadian citizen.
Okay.
That's very different from countries like Germany, where you can be gone, for example, for 500 years, having lived, being ethnically German, living, let's say, in Russia or Romania or someplace, would be allowed to apply for citizenship and return to Germany as being an ethnic German. We no longer have that idea in Canada.
They have to apply for citizenship in Germany, or is it from birth?
They would have to make that application, yeah.
Right.
So now, Gordon, and I'm glad you raised the matter of birthright, because, again, we assume so much in Canada, because if we're born here, it's a done deal, and for all our kids. Unless, as it turns out, you at Maynard Kisher Stojkovic deal with a lot of corporations and a lot of professional people who move around the world as part of their careers. It's what they do. So, and Canadians, of course, are as mobile as any other people in the world. So we got Canadians all over the place making big bucks and having fun and raising families. So if mom and dad, both Canadians, are in France or wherever and they have a child, is that child, Rudy, automatically a Canadian because mom and dad are? Is that child also automatically a dual, being born on foreign soil?
Well, they automatically have their Canadian citizenship,
right.
and it would depend on the country where they're born.
So Canada has nothing to do with the dual
has
half.
Nothing to do.
Canada can make a rule that says people born in Canada are Canadian citizens, but they can't make a rule for other countries.
True.
So every country has its own rules about who is a citizen from birth. In Canada, the rule is people who are born in Canada are citizens. People who are first generation born abroad are Canadian citizens. If one of your parents was a Canadian citizen and you are born abroad, then you are a Canadian citizen as well, as long as your parent or one of them was also born in Canada.
Okay.
If your parent got their citizenship because they were born abroad, then it's too late for you.
Interesting stuff. Now, is this recent?
Now,
These
that change
modifications?
was recent.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's important to remember in terms of dual citizenship, there's, in the past, I think it was until 76, you weren't, as a Canadian, allowed generally to have dual citizenship.
Yes, yeah.
And in the United States, I think it was until 1996, Americans weren't allowed to have dual citizenship, right, except under certain circumstances. So a lot of countries, Japan, China, restrict, and India, for example, restrict citizenship that you can only have once. The idea being that if you go into battle, if we're at war, we want to make sure your loyalty is with us and that you are basically our subject. And Canada has a more modern view of, people can have two allegiances, right?
So and also India has rules like if you want to own land in India, you have to be an Indian citizen.
Okay.
So there's a lot of expatriate Indians who live abroad, worldwide, but don't take out foreign citizenship because they don't want to give up the land that they owned in
or even worse, they might own land, so they can't inherit the land. So their father's back home, and they won't take out because they won't be able to inherit the land that they know they would have a right to.
Interesting stuff. Yeah. So on the matter of dual citizenship, you're only a dual citizen if the country in which you were born grants you citizenship by virtue, as we would, by virtue of your simply having been born there.
Or being born of an American parent, for instance, in Canada.
Okay.
All right.
So in Canada, though, for people, for any person, any small person born here is automatically a Canadian.
Yes.
Full stop, period.
Full stop.
Yeah. So you have cases, as we were discussing during the break, of which people organize their affairs such that they can give birth to their child in Canada, so that child will receive automatically
Canadian citizenship. Now, is that gaming the system, Rudy? Or is it legal? Is it kind of shady? What's the deal?
I think it is. Is it gaming? Yeah, it's you're planning to try and get your child Canadian citizenship. What's your connection to Canada? Maybe a week in Canada at the hospital of VGH. I don't think there's a lot of connection to Canada. Why do we allow it? I think the underlying premise is that we don't want people to be stateless. So the idea is that if you're born in Canada, you're part of our Canadian family, and you have a right to remain here to prevent situations where people don't know where they should be getting their passport or don't have a right to live someplace. I mean, statelessness, while it doesn't happen to a lot of Canadians, is a problem worldwide for certain minorities. So that is sort of the idea behind it. The problem with it is, with international travel becoming as easy as it is, people can now get on a flight and say, okay, I'm going to sit over here, and it's not uncommon for some Korean tour groups to organize, a tour to come over here and have the baby here, and they'll arrange the whole package, negotiate with the hospital. The price is paid.
Sure, yeah.
Right? And they're, from what I can see under the regulations, they're not in breach if they're being honest about their intentions, and they arrive at the airport and say, here's a letter from the hospital. My plan is to have the baby. I've got insurance to cover if there's complications. The immigration guard really has to let them in. Now, the government has talked about this being an issue, and they didn't make it on this round of citizenship changes, but I think it's still a live issue. The reality is very few people do this.
Right.
I mean, most women want to be close to home when they're having the baby.
Of course.
They want to be close to their mother, and they want to be in a nice environment they're familiar with, and it doesn't happen that often. So to change the rules for a small amount, the government seems to put it on the back burner for
now.
now.
But where it feels like we're being gamed here by slick foreigners, Gordon, is that this would then be seen as, well, I've got a little Canadian baby now, so gosh, that's my ticket to coming into Canada too.
Well,
a family member is Canadian.
Having a baby in Canada doesn't give you any ability to be here or remain here. If you are lucky enough that your child grows up, establishes residence here, meets the qualifications for sponsorship, then ultimately after the age of 18, they can apply to sponsor you to come to Canada.
But there's no automatic parent
process.
thing that because I had this little
Nope,
baby
not
here,
at all.
then the door's open for me too. Somebody's got to look after him.
Nope.
Interesting. Well, I'm glad to hear that.
The position of the government is if you want your baby to stay here, that's fine. You make the necessary arrangements so you can't stay here.
Yeah, right. Well, again, I think, Rudy, this is such a good show to do this morning because there are a lot of popularly held misconceptions. I think immigration is such a confusing issue. And for those of us who were fortunate enough and blessed enough to be born here, we make a lot of assumptions, and many of them are just flat out wrong, aren't they?
Yeah, I think, it takes, unfortunately, immigration, I think, is the fastest changing area of law next to sort of tax and criminal. It's a very political field, and therefore it changes a lot, and it's used by the government, to sort of to gain votes in their base and make sure they're satisfying their base.
Right.
So it gets used quite a bit.
Okay, I'm going to take a quick break here, and we'll carry on. The story, we talked about this on the last program, the story about the mom from the Philippines who was going to bring in her young teenage daughter she's deaf, and the government of Canada turned the application down flat, saying this young woman is going to be a tremendous burden to the healthcare system, et cetera, et cetera. Slam, the door gets closed, and mom's worked in Canada forever and a day, and she's going, what? I've done everything right. And so it actually has a happy ending. We'll tell you more about that when we return here on CIL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CIL 650.